Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I've been living in this coastal area for about 5 years now. My wife and I moved here for my job at a marine research center. We fell in love with the charming old neighborhood and the waterfront views. But living in a low-lying area next to the intracoastal waterway comes with its challenges, especially during storm season. Our house sits in one of the lowest spots on the street. When storms hit, we often get surge flooding that can take days to recede. It's a constant cycle of water coming in with high tide and draining out at low tide. Most of us on the street have to deal with this, pumping water from our yards into the drainage system. Last week we had a nasty storm. The surge brought in 3 to 4 feet of water, and my crawl space was completely flooded. It's basically the lowest point in the area, so all the water just flows there and sits unless we pump it out. After a long day of cleanup, my wife and I decided to treat ourselves to dinner at a local restaurant. We were exhausted and needed a break, but just as we sat down to eat, my phone started blowing up with texts from my neighbor. My neighbor texted me, demanding that I turn off my pump immediately. She complained that she couldn't walk around her house because of all the water. I was confused. I called another neighbor to figure out what was going on. I asked him what was happening back at the house. He explained that the storm drains were backing up, with water coming out instead of going in. While I was on this call, I got another text from the first neighbor. She told me that she had moved my hose and it was now shooting water back under my house. She accused me of doing something illegal. I rushed back home to find a firefighter in front of our houses. The firefighter was explaining to my neighbor that what I was doing was perfectly legal and necessary to prevent further property damage. My neighbor protested, insisting that I needed to consider the neighbors and that I couldn't just pump water into the street. I tried to explain that I was only doing what everyone else on the street was doing to manage flooding. She retorted that she didn't care and accused me of ruining her property. At this point, I'd had enough. I decided to comply with her demands, but in a way she might not like. I told her that I would stop pumping into the street. I moved my hose to my side yard, which slopes down to her property before reaching the street. Within hours, her yard and dirt driveway were flooded. Most of her driveway is actually on my property. The next day, the police showed up. The officer told my neighbor that she was no longer allowed on my property under any circumstances, including parking on my land. When she asked where she was supposed to park, the officer told her she'd have to park on the street. My neighbor protested, pointing out that parking on the street was illegal due to the narrow roads. The officer confirmed that this was indeed correct. She dug herself into a hole she couldn't get out of. Now, not only was her yard flooded, but she had nowhere to legally park her car. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. But then I remembered how she'd messed with my property and tried to worsen my flooding situation. Sometimes people need to learn the hard way, that being a good neighbor goes both ways. As I watched her struggle with her newfound predicament, I couldn't help but think about the irony. All of this could have been avoided if she'd just been understanding about our shared flooding issues. Instead, her entitlement led her to create a much bigger problem for herself. In the days that followed, the water eventually receded, and life in our neighborhood started to return to normal. Well, except for my neighbor. She was left to deal with the consequences of her actions, navigating her flooded yard and trying to figure out where to park her car. While I don't regret standing up for myself, I hope that in the future we can all work together as a community to handle these natural disasters. After all, we're all in the same boat, or should I say, the same flood zone. As a police officer, you see a lot of crazy things on the job, but this day was something else entirely. It started like any other shift, cruising the streets, keeping an eye out for trouble. That's when I spotted a beat-up sedan speeding down Main Street, weaving between lanes. I flipped on my lights and sirens, expecting the usual routine. Pull him over, maybe write a ticket. But this driver had other plans. The moment I hit the sirens, that car took off like a bat out of hell. The chase was on. I radioed it in, telling dispatch about the vehicle fleeing a traffic stop. I gave our location and asked for backup and air support. Dispatch responded, confirming that backup and a helicopter were on the way. For the next 20 minutes, we tore through the city. This kid, because that's who it turned out to be, was driving like he had a death wish. Blowing red lights, cutting across lawns in the works. I've got to hand it to him, he had skills, but he was gonna get someone killed. Finally, we hit the suburbs. The helicopter was overhead now, its spotlight cutting through the night. That's when the suspect did something I didn't expect. He ditched the car. Right in the middle of Oakwood Drive, he just slammed on the brakes, jumped out, and started running between houses. I got out to chase him on foot, but it was dark, and he had a head start. The helicopter team reported that the suspect was on foot, heading north through backyards. They then told us that he had just entered a house at 1542 Maple Street. I radioed to the other units closing in, telling them to converge on that address and that the suspect was inside. We approached the house cautiously. Before we could even knock, the front door flew open. There stood a woman, maybe in her 40s, wild-eyed and screaming. She was yelling at us to leave, insisting there was no one in the house and that we were making a mistake. She declared she wouldn't let us in. She was hysterical, trying to block the doorway. We tried to reason with her, explaining that we had reason to believe a suspect had entered her home and that we needed her to step aside and let us in. That's when all hell broke loose. We heard gunshots from the backyard. The helicopter pilot's voice crackled over the radio, urgently reporting that shots had been fired. He told us that the suspect was in the backyard, firing a rifle at them. The woman started screaming even louder, trying to claim it was just fireworks. She kept yelling at us to leave them alone and that we had no right to be there. At this point, she was actively interfering with a police operation and potentially harboring a dangerous suspect. We had no choice. I ordered her to get on the ground with her hands behind her head. She didn't comply, so we had to take her down. As we cuffed her and secured her in the front yard, she kept yelling, insisting we couldn't do this to her. She claimed to know her rights and threatened to sue all of us. With her secured, we focused on the house. The SWAT team arrived and what followed was a tense standoff that lasted hours. The suspect, who we now knew was just a teenager, kept firing off rounds, keeping us pinned down. As the sun started to rise, the SWAT team finally managed to force him out. And wouldn't you know it, turns out the screaming woman was his mother. The kid was in deep trouble, fleeing a traffic stop, reckless endangerment, destruction of property, and attempted murder of the helicopter crew. And his mom? She was looking at charges for obstruction of justice and harboring a fugitive. Later, we learned more about what led to this mess. The kid, barely 16, had been running with a bad crowd. He'd gotten mixed up in some petty crime, mostly shoplifting and vandalism. His mom, instead of setting him straight, always made excuses for him. She'd tell anyone who'd listen that he was a good boy, just misunderstood. The night of the chase, he'd stolen his mom's car to go joyriding with his friends. When I tried to pull him over for speeding, he panicked. He had a bag of stolen merchandise in the car and thought he was going to jail for sure, so he ran. His mom, when she realized what was happening, didn't call him or us to turn himself in. Instead, she encouraged him to hide, thinking she could somehow make it all go away. She'd been enabling his behavior for years, and this was the result. A terrified kid making the worst decisions of his life and a mom who couldn't face reality. The judge threw the book at both of them. The kid was tried as an adult due to the severity of his crimes. His mom got 5 years for her role in the incident. As they were led out of the courtroom, I heard the mother reassuring her son. She told him not to worry, saying that she would fix this. She mentioned that they would appeal, insisting that the court couldn't do this to them. Some people just never learn. But maybe this would be the wake-up call they both needed. One can hope anyway. In this job, sometimes hope is all you've got. I guess I should start from the beginning. I was adopted as a baby by a woman I call mother, though she's far from deserving of that title. I endured years of neglect and abuse at her hands and those of her husband. She'd punish me with a hard wooden stick until I bled. And worst of all, she turned a blind eye to the abuse I suffered from her husband. As if that wasn't bad enough, Mother pushed me to chat with older foreign men online when I was just a teenager. She saw it as her ticket to a better life, using me as her meal ticket. It was through one of these connections that I eventually met my husband and moved to another country. Mother saw this as her grand plan coming to fruition. For years, I kept the extent of the abuse hidden from my extended family. They knew Mother was difficult, but they had no idea how bad it really was. That all changed recently when I decided to share my story online. The support I received was overwhelming, and it gave me the courage to finally confront Mother. I showed my cousin the post and all the responses. They were horrified and agreed that Mother was completely out of her mind. But the real shock came when we had a group call with my aunt, uncle, and mother. My aunt started the call by angrily accusing Mother of being a greedy, selfish woman who had allowed a pedophile to hurt her child. Mother acted confused and claimed she had done nothing wrong. My aunt then demanded to know why Mother thought she was entitled to move in with me and spend my hard-earned money. Mother's response was shocking. She claimed that I owed her because she was the reason I met my husband and moved to a wealthy country. She insisted that I should be thanking her for this opportunity. My hands were shaking as I listened to her continue her rant. She denied knowing anything about the abuse I had endured, including the punishments and the chats with older men. She argued that she didn't need to do any real parenting because she had already invested in me by adopting me when my birth mother was dying. She even claimed that my grandmother had done most of the raising anyway. My aunt was incredulous at Mother's statements. Mother then declared that she was entitled to my money and care because she was old and needed to be taken care of. She insisted it was my duty as a daughter, regardless of how my family felt about it. I gasped at her audacity, too shocked to speak. My aunt's face went pale and my uncle looked furious. He told Mother that she had no right to call herself a mother since she had failed to do anything a real mother should do for their child. Finally, finding my voice, I told Mother that she needed to forget about her plans. I made it clear that this phone call had only strengthened my resolve to keep her away from me and my family. Mother's response was to scream down the phone, forcing us all to hang up before things got even more heated. After the call, I thanked my cousin and her family, especially my aunt, for standing up for me. My aunt expressed shock at the extent of Mother's behavior, admitting they had always seen her as difficult but never imagined it was this bad. I apologized for keeping it from them for so long, explaining that I had been afraid of not being believed. My cousin reassured me, saying that they were the ones who should be sorry for not seeing what was happening. My uncle promised that they would be there for me from now on, and that Mother would never bother me again. For the first time in my life, I felt truly supported and understood by my family. Mother's true colors were finally exposed, and I knew I could move forward without her toxic presence in my life. I received messages from other family members who had heard about what happened. They all offered their support and apologized for not seeing the signs earlier. Mother tried to reach out a few times, alternating between angry demands and tearful pleas, but I cut her out of my life. My husband and I decided to take a vacation to visit my extended family, strengthening those bonds that Mother had tried so hard to keep weak. As we sat around my aunt's dinner table, laughing and sharing stories, I realized that I had finally found the loving family I'd always longed for. Mother's entitled behavior had backfired spectacularly, and instead of gaining access to my life and money, she had lost everything. And me? I had gained a whole new world of love and support. I've always been a tech-savvy kid, which is why my cousin often comes to me for help with her gadgets. She goes to this fancy private school that hands out laptops to students at the start of each year. These aren't your average laptops though. They're loaded with special software that limits what you can do on them, basically turning them into glorified homework machines. When the school year began, every student had to pay a $200 security deposit for these laptops. The deal was simple. Take care of the laptop, get your deposit back at the end of the year, damage or lose it, and say goodbye to your money. Seemed fair enough, right? Well, things took a wild turn when it was time to return the laptops. The school started claiming all sorts of bogus damages on perfectly good devices. Students and parents were furious, knowing full well their laptops were in pristine condition. My cousin told me about it one day after school. She was fuming. She ranted about how the school was claiming her laptop had a cracked screen, even though it was spotless. I agreed that it was messed up and asked what she planned to do. She explained that many students were claiming they had lost their laptops to avoid the fake damage claims. I told her it seemed like a smart move and asked if she was thinking of doing the same. She admitted she was considering it, since she wasn't getting her deposit back anyway. And that's exactly what she did. But the school wasn't having it. They went full dictator mode, threatening to prevent students from graduating if they didn't return their laptops. This was a complete violation of the agreement we all signed at the beginning of the year. That's when all hell broke loose. Parents were calling lawyers left and right. The media caught wind of the story, and suddenly, our little school drama was all over the local news. Students started boycotting classes for the final weeks. I even saw a group of angry parents protesting on the school lawn when I went to pick up my cousin one day. One parent was shouting that it was highway robbery. Another complained about how their kids had worked hard all year only to be treated this way. I even overheard a teacher declaring that they couldn't work for an institution that treats students so poorly and announcing their resignation on the spot. It was absolute chaos. The school tried to stand its ground, but they were fighting a losing battle. The bad publicity was too much for them to handle. Eventually, they caved and settled out of court. My cousin called me with the news. She excitedly told me that the school was returning the deposits. I congratulated her and asked if she was planning to give the laptop back. She surprised me by asking if I could help her jailbreak it instead, to make it work like a normal laptop. I agreed to help, telling her to back up her personal stuff so I could wipe the school software off it. She thanked me profusely and said she'd bring it over the next day. So that's what we did. I removed all the restrictive software and turned it into a regular laptop. It felt good to stick it to the school one last time. I'm proud of how the students and parents stood up to the school's greed. Some might say it was just $200, but it wasn't about the money. It was about principle. The school thought they could get away with cheating hundreds of families out of thousands of dollars. They learned the hard way that you can't mess with people like that and expect them to take it lying down. In the end, the school's reputation took a major hit. They lost the trust of their students, parents, and even some of their staff. I heard they had to implement a whole new system for laptop distribution and returns the following year, with third-party inspections to ensure fairness. As for my cousin, she got to keep her now unrestricted laptop as a souvenir of her final year in the Great Laptop Rebellion of 2024. Every time she uses it, it's a reminder that standing up for what's right, even against powerful institutions, can make a difference. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.